So good morning and welcome to CISA's SNAP seminar or panel on Russia-Ukraine. What's happening? What's the context? What's next? I would like to thank our two professors who pulled this panel together literally on Friday for today, Dr. Pokolova and Dr. McFate at the my far left of the table. Thank you guys very much, as well as our moderator and our technical team and the rest of CISA who enabled us to do this so quickly. One of the reasons we wanted to do this, in addition to the obvious, we need to talk about this, we have Ukrainian students, we have Ukrainian alum, we have students and alumni from frontline states that are obviously, as we are, very concerned, very worried. They have family and friends in Ukraine, in Russia. This is not a good situation. One of the hallmarks of CISA is that we are a network of practitioners. We are civilian, we are military, and we are foreign partners. For the people who are watching online who don't know about CISA, we are about half foreign partner students and half American. The hallmark of what we do is to build networks, to build relationships, and to become a really operational network of practitioners. So our alumni matter greatly to us, and so we wanted to, and you guys will all be alumni very soon, almost in the end of your year here. But CISA is the Department of Defense flagship institution for the building of partnership capacity in combating terrorism and irregular warfare at the strategic level. We specialize in education for leadership. We have over a decade of successfully producing leaders who can not only implement, but who can create strategies. Several of the theses that our students write, especially written by our foreign partner students, have become the counterterrorism or irregular warfare strategy for their countries. So we produce these, they produce it under the brilliant leadership of our faculty, which is Title X civilian academics from the top institutions in our country and military and interagency practitioners. So it's a robust partnership to produce the kind of leaders that can write and implement and create strategies. Our focus is on CT, counterterrorism, irregular warfare, and irregular warfare within great power competition. CISA is a fully accredited master's program under Middle States Regional Accreditation, and it is a JPME, Joint Professional Military Education 2 program as well. CISA runs a master's program at Fort Bragg, North Carolina for our special forces, U.S. interagency, and partner nations as well. So I want to thank everybody for coming together at the very last minute. I will turn this over to Sean McFate, Dr. McFate, to introduce our speakers, and then we'll start with Dr. Hill and work our way across the panel. Thank you.
So good morning, and thank you for making time to discuss this shocking events in the last couple days. We're very fortunate to get experts. We have Ambassador Bill Hill. He was in charge of OSCE for 7 years, and which meant he lived and worked with Russians, Ukrainians, and Moldova for 7 years. He's now a fellow at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, and he's the author of Russia, the Near Abroad, and the West. We are very grateful that he can come here short notice to explain what's going on. Next, we have Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff. He's a distinguished research fellow at INSS here at National Defense University. His specialty is this region, Russian defense policy, and the Ukraine. He will reveal for us what is going on. He's going to get as close as he can to telling us what's in Putin's head. Is that right? Okay. And then myself, who you know, is Dr. Sean McFate. I'm a professor here at CISA, and I will discuss implications for the future of war and U.S. national security strategy. As you know, the new national defense strategy, the national security strategy, is coming out later this spring. We'll see if they take all the right lessons or all the wrong lessons from this event. So with that, what we'll do is each panelist will speak for just about 10 minutes, so we maximize Q&A. We are also on live stream. We'll take questions from live stream. This event is unclassified, but it's off the record, okay? All right, with that, sir, Ambassador Hill, the floor is yours.
Make use of the podium since it's here, and means I get to walk around a little bit. First of all, thank you. It's really a great pleasure to come back to, always a great pleasure to come back to NDU, and thanks to Ambassador Holt, Dr. McFate, and Dr. Pokolova for inviting me. Greta, Yelena, and Sean, thank you very much. Some of you, just briefly, I understand some of you, or you may have had the opportunity to look at my bio in case so you know some of my personal background. I started as an academic, worked for many years as a state Foreign Service officer, and then for 10 years a professor at the National War College. In terms of the region, some things that may not show up in there, I was at Leningrad University a very long time ago, a classmate of one Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I didn't meet him there, although he did have a corridor reputation of sorts. But I did spend a lot of time in Russia, Ukraine. I did mill-to-mill relations for the Pentagon with Ukraine in the late 90s, as well as working for the OSCE out in the field in Moldova, working with representatives all three. So I've had a chance to listen to them in their own offices and homes and get sort of an idea of how they look at this and what I see happening. I mean, obviously we're in the midst of a major war between Russia and Ukraine, a really seemingly unprovoked Russian pressure and invasion on Ukraine. Why did the Russians do this? How did this happen? I put this in the context of Russian discontent with the overall post-Cold War political and security settlement in Europe and in the world. This discontent has been growing since the early 1990s, especially since the late 2000s, and with the Russian seizure and annexation of Crimea and provocation of the war in Donbass in 2014, this post-Cold War order of trying to integrate Russia and Russia trying to be integrated into a larger European political and security order has basically ended. And what we've been seeing with the war in Donbass and events since 2014 is basically a battle over what a new order will look like, where Russia is demanding a greater voice and some way of limiting the fundamental Western institutions in this order, the European Union and NATO. What the Russians are saying in Ukraine about NATO, they don't like NATO there and they're worried about NATO in Ukraine as far as it goes, but there's a lot more. They're worried about a pro-Western, a geopolitical orientation there, which extends not just to NATO, but to the broader Western presence and orientation. And I look upon the current war as an escalation of the battles of between Russia and the West over what this new order would look like. Now, Putin's and Russia's problems with Ukraine go back at least to 2004. Putin actively campaigned. He went to Ukraine in 2004 and campaigned for Yanukovych in the presidential campaign. I mean, you talk about interference in elections. And he saw the Orange Revolution, which overturned the first alleged victory of Yanukovych and resulted in the election of Yushchenko. He saw the Orange Revolution as both a political and a personal setback and defeat. The 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO issued a compromise statement saying that Ukraine and Georgia someday will be members of the alliance, raised great hostility in Putin and in Russians in general. You know what happened in Georgia. In a broader sense, at that time, then President Dmitry Medvedev issued a proposed security treaty, which was remarkably similar to the proposals that you saw Russia give to NATO and the United States at the end of last year. And if you look at the provisions, what was key to it was it offered a way for Russia both to veto future NATO expansion and to limit, not just expansion, but to limit NATO activities. For a time, with the election of Yanukovych as president in 2010 and the extension of the Black Sea Fleet basing agreement, political and security relations between Russia and Ukraine seemed to be on track. But by 2013, as Yanukovych proved, he wasn't looking to join NATO, but he was looking to get closer to the EU. And Putin objected to the Ukraine signing an association agreement with the EU because that would limit the possibility for Ukrainian participation in and integration into the Eurasian Economic Union and closer cooperation, integration with Russia. Well, we know what happened. I mean, Putin pressed Yanukovych to reject the EU association agreement. That led to the Maidan protests. Putin got Yanukovych to try to suppress these protests. That resulted in fighting in the streets, which eventually resulted in Yanukovych fleeing the country. This was not a Western-imposed coup. This was something that Russia and the Ukrainian president tried to do, something that the Ukrainian population objected to violently, and it led to a real collision. And so in 2014, Russia took Crimea. I mean, to me, primarily this is to secure the Black Sea Fleet, because Russia was not willing to have a pro-NATO government in Ukraine with their major Black Sea, that major military installation dependent upon that sort of government. Russia instigated the Donbass Rebellion. It was actually, aimed at a broader range, what some Russians historically have called Novorossiya, a southern and eastern part of Ukraine that was largely settled during the reign of Catherine the Great, when Russia conquered large swaths of what's now southern Ukraine from Turkey. In any case, this was aimed at destabilizing a pro-Western Ukrainian government and perhaps getting a more favorable government in Kyiv. It didn't work. The Donbass pressure didn't work, and pro-NATO sentiment grew in Ukraine. And finally, in 2020, 21, 22, during the pandemic, things come to a head. People say, well, we understand why Putin puts pressure on Ukraine, wants to get into Ukraine because they want a friendly government, they want it secured. But why did he pick now to invade? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. I see this as an effort of Russia, as part of an effort of Russia to secure its entire Western periphery, not only Ukraine, but Belarus and Moldova, the buffer states that lie between Russia and the bulk of NATO countries. The 2020 revolt in Belarus was put down only with great effort. And this was seen very seriously by the Russians, a really serious threat to Russians' political stability at home and to their military security. And it led to Russia taking a different view of a Ukraine that was increasingly becoming anti-Russian and more pro-Western. At the same time, in 2020 and 21, in Moldova, a pro-Western president and then parliament was elected, and the Russians have been putting quietly but very seriously pressure on the pro-Western government in Moldova through the use of especially economic pressure. Moldova is entirely 100% dependent on Russia for its energy, natural gas pipeline, and the Russians have been toying with the supply and really, with prices too, and also demands for payment. But with Ukraine, the Russians, several things happened in Ukraine, after since Zelensky was elected, which probably led the Russians to think that they were going to have to intervene more strongly than just the pressure from the Donbass, ongoing war in the Donbass. Zelensky, first of all, grew, coming in as a peace candidate. He very rapidly appears to abandon the Minsk Accords, the Minsk process, the agreement by which Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk would become autonomous areas in Ukraine. It would be essentially, the Ukrainians view it as a Trojan horse in Ukraine. And Zelensky, really, the process is going nowhere, and the Russians can see this. In 2020, Zelensky starts to move against pro-Russian media and political figures, most notably the leader leader of the largest pro-Russian party, Medvedchuk. And this is personal for Putin because Putin is godfather to Medvedchuk's daughter, as well as a pro-Russian party. So you're looking at anti-Russian movements there, and Ukraine is cooperating in military terms and security terms much more closely with both the U.S. and NATO. And they're getting stuff like Turkish drones. They're getting other, after the Trump impeachment and other stuff, lethal assistance finally starts to flow in from the U.S. During the Obama administration, we had provided the Ukrainians with assistance, but not lethal assistance for the war in Donbass. So the Russians look at this. They also look. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was, as the Russians would say, myaко говоря, speaking, very mildly, this was hardly a success. And the Russians may have looked at this and say, okay, we've got a U.S. administration that's in disarray. This is an opportunity. Angela Merkel, who had been the glue, the leader that held Europe together, retired in the fall of 2021. And so the Russians look at this and say, well, this may be an opportunity. So they put the pressure on. They started building the pressure. Military pressure began early in 2021 and has grown through the year up until the invasion last week. What's Russia's aim? I think, first of all, a friendly, pliant government in Kyiv. I mean, they basically want to accomplish regime change. But beyond that, Russia, and not just Putin, is a revisionist power, and it seeks to change some elements of the post-Cold War political and security order, and perhaps some borders in Europe. Now, I believe personally that Russia's territorial aims are pretty limited. But to what extent they're limited, how can we really count on that after watching them go into Georgia once and Ukraine twice? What is the U.S. response? Well, Western unity, solidarity, the U.S., European, NATO, EU solidarity is a must, and so far Russian actions have really helped in achieving this goal. For the foreseeable future, I look at it, Europe is likely to be divided. It's not a new Cold War. There are substantial differences, but Russia is going to be isolated from important segments of the international system. And the Cold War is only going to be an imprecise guide because some things are very, very different. In particular, the presence of China, a strong China, which is going to make isolating Russia and winning a standoff with them a very different proposition from what it was between 1949 and 1989. Relations with Russia are going to be tense, and there are going to be more tests of nerves and tests of will, like yesterday's Russian announcement of nuclear alert. There's going to be more of this. We're going to be nervous again. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis as a young man. I remember, and I have no desire to go through that again, but this is something, as long as we've got folks acting the way they are in the Kremlin, we're probably going to have to live through stuff like this. This is going to revive and accentuate the importance of intelligent, arms control and deconfliction regimes and mechanisms. We're going to need to get back to a system where we are opposing strongly the political aims of our adversary in Moscow, but taking care that we don't let the conflict get out of hand. We've had overall, I look at it and say we've had a remarkably peaceful and prosperous 75 years since the end of World War II, and it looks like that general period, is probably coming to an end, and we're in for a prolonged rough patch. How long is hard to say, before we can fashion a new system to give the kind of stability and security we had during this long period. And what the character of that new system is going to be has yet to be written, and is going to depend upon the vision and the will and the persistence of both those in Ukraine who are fighting actively now and those around the West who are supporting this effort. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot left unsaid, and turn it over to Jeff to go into.
I suppose I will come up here as well. Let me reiterate Ambassador Hill's thanks to Chancellor Holtz, to Professor McFate, and to CISA for hosting this panel, and to all of you for participating. To give a little of my own biographical connection to this as well, I lived in Moscow for a couple of years. I was a fellow at Moscow State University, and in my previous capacity before I came to NDU, I was working at a think tank here in DC, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and one of our big initiatives was Track 2 discussions with Russian counterparts. So I spent a lot of time sitting in rooms with people in the Russian strategic studies community who think about these problems, who have good relationships with people in the interior of the Russian government and can reflect on Russia's perspectives. And on the basis of a lot of those conversations, I've seen a fairly concerning pattern emerge over the last couple of years, which is that these people who represent a wide swath of academia, civil society, informed opinion, if you will, in Russia, find that they have less and less access to decision-making circles, particularly when it comes to matters of war and peace on issues like Ukraine. And the narrowing of the decision-making circles, I think, is both cause and consequence of some of the problems that are currently unfolding in front of us. I think really the conflict around Ukraine centers on two fundamental pieces of the worldview that reign within the Kremlin that sometimes are a little bit hard for us to understand here because we tend not to share them. Ambassador Hill touched a lot on one of these, which has to do with the nature of the European security order. Russia's view is that the European security order that emerged from the Cold War was essentially a victor's peace. It was a peace analogous to the Treaty of Versailles that was imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War. And because of that exclusion, because of the belief that the victorious powers continued to treat Germany as a defeated power, continued to impose on it, there was a strong push for revanchism and for reversing that treaty. And that wasn't unique to the Nazis, that was very widespread within the German political and security elite of the 1920s and 1930s. And there seems to be a similar dynamic at work in Russia today. The other misconception, if you want to call it that, that seems to reign within Russian decision-making circles, and this is the one that I want to focus on because we've heard already about the European security order, has to do with the nature of identity and what it means to be Russian and Ukrainian. This is a theme that Putin, in particular, has emphasized, has spent a lot of time talking and writing, or at least having things written in his name, about the nature of the Russo-Ukrainian relationship. And his view is that Russians and Ukrainians are, as he put it in 2014, in the speech that he gave announcing the annexation of Crimea to the parliament, one people. Now, what does that mean? It means, in Putin's view, that because there is a common history tying the people who live in modern-day Russia, and modern-day Ukraine, and I would add modern-day Belarus, together, that these people are destined by their past to share a common future. This is a version of what the historian Timothy Snyder calls the politics of eternity. That is the idea that one's identity has eternal significance, that it's not subject to change, that politics, changing of identities, changing of preferences, contemporary history doesn't really matter. This is an idea that has a long intellectual tradition in Russian circles. The figure who gets cited most commonly in these discussions is the white Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who's somebody who Putin refers to a lot. I would argue that the person who actually is more influential than Ilyin is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who is probably best known in the West for his works, The Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago, who was a dissident from the Soviet Union and was exiled in the United States and spent about 30 years in Vermont. And as much as he detested the Soviet system, Solzhenitsyn was nonetheless a form of Russian imperial nationalist. In 1990, he wrote an influential pamphlet, if you will, that lays out a vision of what a post-Soviet Russia looks like. Solzhenitsyn argued that the Russian Empire, the further reaches of the empire in the Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as the Baltic states, were a drain on Russia. They were a drain that was taking away Russia's vitality and its identity, and that there was no reason for a post-Soviet Russia to hold on to them. Conversely, he looked at the core East Slavic lands of the old Grand Princedom of Muscovy, which is effectively Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Slavic inhabited parts of northern Kazakhstan, and potentially Moldova, and said that these should be part of a renewed Russian Union, as he called it. And he argued in this same piece that the idea that there were separate peoples inhabiting these regions, that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians were different, that they had different cultures, different national identities, was a recent development. And it wasn't only a recent development, but it was a development that was driven by foreign enemies who were seeking to divide Russia and to keep it weak. In particular, he focused on Poland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, other pre-Soviet enemies, but also on the Bolsheviks who created a Ukrainian republic, as well as a Belarusian republic within the Soviet Union. If we listen to Putin's speech on February 21st, just before the invasion, he talked about Lenin's Ukraine. He said Ukraine in its current borders and its current construction was entirely a product of the Soviet Union. And in fact, it should be called Ukraine named for Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. This reflects this same belief that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, because they have this common past, because they have a language that is, if not mutually intelligible, is derived from the same ancestor, because until recently many of them belong to the same church, that they have this united political fate. Now, the history of the last 30 years has been the development of a separate Ukrainian identity, one that's linked to the territory of the Ukrainian state, irrespective of whether the people who express that identity are speakers of Russian or speakers of Ukrainian, irrespective of which church they belong to. And this process is one that has gone far enough that it seems very difficult to imagine it ever being reversed. I think part of the thinking in Russia, part of why now, is a perception that we're approaching a point of no return on this question of reconstructing an imperial Russian nation. Ambassador Hill referenced the protests in Belarus that broke out in 2020. I think in part these protests were driven by a very similar dynamic. President Lukashenko, who's been in charge in Belarus since 1994, is in some ways an embodiment of this Putinist vision of what the trilateral Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian relationship looks like. He speaks Russian as a primary language. Russian has been the lingua franca within Lukashenko's Belarus. People expounding a distinctive Belarusian identity, whether that's promoting the use of the Belarusian language, whether that's displaying the pre-World War I Belarusian flag when there was the pre-revolutionary Belarusian flag from the period when there was a short-lived Belarusian republic, have been persecuted. Yanukovych in Ukraine expressed a similar outlook despite his proclivity for the EU and his desire to sign an association agreement. He cracked down on the more nationally minded religious organizations in Ukraine, such as the Greek Catholic Church in the West, the Kiev Patriarchate. He was very supportive of the Russian Orthodox Church and its local branch. He spoke Russian primarily, even though he tried to speak Ukrainian sometimes, and had a more Russocentric vision of what Ukraine's future orientation was. This is not a view that is widely shared within Ukrainian society, and in fact, Russia's own interventions in Ukraine, going back to 2014 and the very overt support for Yanukovych, have, if anything, contributed to the further nationalization of Ukrainian society. Today, again, Ukrainians, if you look at linguistic use, the Ukrainian language has spread fairly substantially across the country. Even in most of the eastern oblasts, a plurality are either Ukrainian-speaking or bilingual. If you look at figures for church membership in the branch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is subordinate to the Russian Orthodox Church has dropped by about 50%. Affiliation with the Kiev-based Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Greek Catholic Church, which is mostly based in Western Ukraine, has grown. And the number of people who identify themselves as Ukrainian exclusive of being Russian has grown. And I think that with the current intervention, the current military invasion, you're going to see a similar dynamic. I think the Russians miscalculated quite substantially in terms of the amount of public support they would get. from the Ukrainian population. One of the paradoxes of the first stages of this invasion has been why Russia hasn't used overwhelming force against critical infrastructure, why there's been this encouragement of people from the armed forces to surrender, why there's been this call by the polite people, as they're called in Russian, for ordinary Ukrainians to turn their back on the so-called fascist junta in Kiev and give their loyalty to Russia. I think all of this activity is based on an assumption that there is underlying Ukrainian society this pro-Russian orientation or this identification with an imperial Russian nation that's still there. Never mind the fact that the vast majority of Ukrainians voted in a free and fair election for Volodymyr Zelensky back in 2019. I think this is a fundamental misreading on the part of Russia on how Ukrainians think about themselves and how Russia's own intervention in this conflict is driving that further reorientation away from Russia and toward the West. I don't know how this conflict is going to end. I don't know when it's going to end, but I think one of the fundamental axes along which it's going to be fought is over this axis of what it means to be Ukrainian. If and when there is a Russian military occupation, I expect one of the main focal points is going to be, as Lukashenko has done in Belarus, trying to suppress expressions of an independent Ukrainian identity, trying to suppress organizations that promote Ukrainian language, religious organizations that are not connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, historical narratives that don't reflect the kind of imperial Russian narrative that Putin seems to be promoting. So as much as we focus on the immediate military consequences, I think thinking about what this longer term perspective is going to look like is going to be important as well. So let me stop there. Thanks.
For the first time in a long time, tanks blitzkrieging across another country, airplanes shot down, smoke billowing out of major cities, and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of civilians trickling out, across the country. The UN estimates that right now at least 442,000 refugees have shown up on the shores of the EU. Mostly in Poland, in the middle of winter, and with no place to go. This is shocking for multiple reasons, and we've discussed some of the reasons that are specific to this geolocation. I want to talk about something slightly different. This is the first time in 40 years we have seen conventional warfare. The last big conventional wars were the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War, the Falkland Islands, and this is the first conventional war since Hitler did this in 1939. The world is locked in cognitive dissonance. And what I want to briefly discuss is, how do you think this might change U.S. national security strategy, community, NATO, et cetera? Just to set it up for Q&A. Now, there's already a lot of pundits in American politics and TV who are saying this is a new epic, which is pretty brazen if you think about. It's been 96 hours, and we're talking about a new epic of decades. They're saying it's a new Cold War, and as Ambassador Hill has already mentioned, let's not get caught in that trap, because there's a lot of differences between the Cold War and today, and it can be the wrong model. It can be strategically misleading. My concern, and see if you agree with it or not, is that the Department of Defense and the national security establishment here will learn all the wrong lessons from this experience as they, finish their final edits on the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, which is going to come out in weeks or maybe a few months. I believe that the U.S. is locked in a conventional war paradigm. It's one of the reasons we've struggled against irregular war foes in the last 70 years. And now that they see tanks on the ground, they're going to be like, dog, squirrel, Of course, never mind that Russia is doing a lot of irregular war things too, like cyber, active measures, dense propaganda, using mercenaries. They're doing a lot of other things too. It's not just a conventional war fight. And it's also NATO. So I am concerned that this will double down in our confirmation bias of conventional war, when great power competition will be largely in a regular war fight, because we can't risk nuclear warfare, the 1962 moment, as Ambassador Hill also mentioned. So what could we do? Let's do a thought experiment. I don't want to own these suggestions, but I do want to stir some thinking. I believe modern warfare is getting sneakier. The reason it's getting sneakier is that we live in an information age. That's not going away anytime soon, where suddenly anybody with one of these can become an influencer, right? So, and we have, we have people in the streets of Kiev, including the president, holding one of these, saying, "Hey, I'm here. I'm not, fleeing the country. I need ammunition, not a ride." So, what are some things we could do? Well, there's lots of things we could do if we decided to do so. First of all, we could support an insurgency if a viable resistance movement arises. But it would probably have to be based out of a NATO country like Poland or Romania, because you can't, as President Biden has said, and I think correctly, you can't have U.S. troops or NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, because if they get caught by Russian troops, that hands Putin a huge propaganda win that would make the Gary Powers trial look like, it would be like Gary Powers' trial with Kim Kardashian as the stage manager. So also if there's a firefight, it could escalate into nuclear Armageddon. That sounds preposterous. But if there's one law about warfare, is the law of the unexpected. Other things that we could do, we could, of course, besides sanctions, we could do some dark arts information of our own. Now, I don't think we need to create disinformation. All we could, for example, maybe we could do is create pirate VPNs. So Russian citizens, Chinese citizens, and others can Google whatever they want, and let the truth reveal. Let them question their leadership. Other things that we could do, Russia hates color revolutions. Let's start a few. Russia is an empire, as we've just heard from Dr. Mankoff, for centuries has other countries on its periphery with deep enmity towards Moscow. Let's prop them up. Or how about the idea of this? We always say that democracies are, we're weak because anybody can infiltrate or hack our elections, but democracies are resilient. Autocracies are brittle. And at the head of that is an autocrat who has a big ego. Putin has would you say he has a big ego, Ambassador Hill? Yeah, okay, even back in the day, right? Putin rides around half naked on bears. Let's do something with that, right? Can't we? He leads cranes on the migration route on a hang glider. Can't we ridicule that some way? Also the top of autocracies, the reason that they can fight this type of warfare very well is because they are surrounded by a ring of lieutenants. They centralize authority at the very top. Is there some way we could covertly influence Putin to believe that some of his lieutenants want to stage a palace coup so that he takes his lieutenants out for us? Now, I'm not saying we should do all these things, or any of them, but we should think about them. We thought about them during the Cold War with some good news stories and bad news stories. But right now it seems like the U.S. is, we're not ready to cross those lines. Perhaps we should rethink crossing some of those lines. The way to get Russia or China, the way to inhibit their expeditionary warfare is if we can get them more focused on regime security than punching out to their neighbors. They will voluntarily pull back somewhat. And that is the way we can fight and win against autocracy. It's not, we're going to blitzkrieg into Belarus with NATO forces. It's these other and newer types of sneaky tactics. And it's not that I'm endorsing them, but I want to put them on the table for some thought and discussion. So with